I was amazed at the extent of shared heritage we have in the region, particularly the fishways, festivals, women's roles, as well as the role of tourism on the sustainability of maritime cultural heritage. At this point, I'd like to open the floor for questions and comments, and we already have quite a few sent through the chat box. So if I may start, the first question I believe is for Steve. Is there some kind of business in creating the boats out of the trees? Is it legal in the country? And do you think it will lead to deforestation? Steve, may respond.
Thank you. No, we're talking about very, very small scale industry here, micro industry at the village level. So the craftsmen who build these boats, they tend to use an invasive species. And this invasive species is a big problem in Samoa. It's replacing a lot of the native trees. So where they used native trees in the past, they now have this invasive species, which is their preferred timber to make the boats. So to answer your question, it's not illegal. It's not a big industry. We're only talking about some 300 villages throughout the islands. And in each village, there might be 5 tufunga who build boats every year. So there could be every year, maybe 1,000 trees, but this invasive species is just taking over the landscape. Is there another part to your question? No, it won't lead to deforestation. In fact, it'll be a little bit helpful if we were able to control the spread of this invasive species. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I suppose you were able to cover all the points raised in the question. So the next question I have here is, I believe, for Yung Jong Jong. Is Yung Jong Jong? So what are the changes that tiffs have made to make sure that fishing is kept safe amidst the pandemic?
Hi, as you know, the Korea government applied to the COVID-19 very safe way, and also a lot of tourist means. I mean, it can be harmful to the tourism. Because if many visitors went to the area, it can be infected by COVID-19. So Korea government makes some rules. People should wear a mask always and keep their hands clean. But with that personal policy, we can keep our nature as it is. And also the resident of the place agree to limit the number of tourists. Of course, the income of the tourism goes down after COVID, but the best thing is, since then, Korean gets some fame that the word of cleanliness, it's really important. Even though the money from the tourism and the money from the tourism can goes down shortly, but in the long run, if we keep our nature as it is and we keep ourselves clean, we can move on to the better place, I think. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Yung Jong, and thank you also for bringing up the topic on tourism. So the next question is for Dr. Delaney. How do you think has tourism affected festivals in Japan that you mentioned, like for instance the Hama Obon, and has it become a spectacle of sorts, considering the tourist gaze with the influx of tourists coming into Japan to participate or maybe just to witness these festivals? Dr. Delaney.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah, yeah, the Hamo bone is more of a private ritual and activity, and the port festival, the Minato Matsuri, is the big tourism one. It's interesting because I don't know if it's a societal change, but when I first lived there, the festival took place at a different time period, and I could see that a lot of times people then would take off of work, right? Because this is an important activity. And then over the decades, I've seen it change dates several times, and now they changed it specifically to coincide with the national holiday system. And so what we're seeing is it's kind of the shell, right? The just the face of it is then being used by the tourism board, right, to try to bring more people in. And of course, this area of Japan, especially up through the early 80s, Japan was somewhat closed. People couldn't travel out very much and take long holidays. And so it was a very big domestic travel destination. And it was a really core area that people visited domestically. But now with the rise of more international travel, it might change with COVID-19. But with the rise of international travel, the economy of the areas really fell. And in the same area, they also had a shipbuilding, which has also fallen. So they're looking at the tourism as a way to really bring in money. But again, it's this double-edged sword, of course, which you see with tourism. But so what they're incorporating then, I think of, is really just kind of these superficial aspects. And maybe oftentimes that's all tourists need, right? When we go to various places around the world and we see a show by the local peoples, it's also just the kind of the brush strokes that they are being presented to people. But on the other hand, it's also important because it is the landscape and the seascape that is a big draw. It's important then for them to focus on maintaining, like limiting the amounts of pollution and impact by people on the area, because that's also what the draw is. I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully.
Yes, perfectly. Okay, thank you, Dr. Delaney. So I suppose the next question is for William. Yeah. The question from Facebook is, are there new fish weirs being built in Yap? And for the new ones, if there are any, for maintaining them, are there new techniques for maintaining them, I suppose?
Thank you for the question. No, there are no new fish weirs outside of the 800 being built. So they are reviving and trying to revive the master builders to teach younger people to maintain the existing weirs. The 800 relates to a far larger population in Yap, probably 20 to 30,000 people when the fish weirs were, the 800 were, maybe they're not all being used at once. So there's plenty there. Some of the ones that are being revived and restored, there's only about 20 or 30 of them that's being carried out. The rest are not being used. We tried in the project that I did, tried to encourage people, because they see these as traditional techniques and traditional fishing practices using traditional ecological knowledge and therefore sustainable. So they're not wanting to create new ones as such, but just to revive some of the current ones.
Follow up to the question, is the extraction and use of the materials sustainable?
So the stone that they mainly use, the basalt rock, some of it can be sourced by the coastline. The ones further out on the reef flat are coral and with some basalt. So it's not sustainable to build new ones, and I think to rebuild the 800 is not sustainable either because of the coral that's needed or the basalt rock. Maybe there's some melding of what's there, down to sort of 400 or even 200 or 300 are used. I mean, the issue is that they're all owned by individuals, and they're on another estate's land, even on the reef lap. So it's an interesting dilemma. They're not therefore promoted for tourism as such. The canoes, the stone money, they have a traditional Yap Day. It's a weekend in March. They're the things that are promoted for tourism rather than the fishways, are more for local people and their own use.
Okay, thank you. Last for Dr. William, are there adjustments that have been made on the traditional construction of the weirs to accommodate the new normal, so to speak, in terms of hazards from the environment?
Well, that's been part of the problem, and why there's been a resurgence in interest. A few years ago, maybe 20 years ago, a number of them were knocked around by a big typhoon. They get typhoons occasionally. So if they're not maintained because of the typhoons or the storms, they just lose it. You can't use the fish. So some of them are being revived and reused. And I think, maybe a few hundred, certainly not several, 800 would be revived and reused again.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have one question here for Dr. Dedi. Are there clearly set criteria for traditional or non-destructive fishing tools and methods as stated in community fishing rules? Are motorized boats considered non-traditional?
Yeah, usually destructive fishing is associated with blast fishing and sided fishing. So all fishing techniques associated with these two things are considered as destructive fishing. On the boats, on the motorized boat, it depends on actually more on the boat size rather than the engine. And also certain locally developed criteria. For example, diving with torch and underwater torch is prohibited by local standard because for tourism it was associated with too effective for fishing fish schooling. And the second one is considered as not socially fair because other people, other fishers, usually local village-based fishers, use more traditional gears such as line fishing and other gears that is, more selective in terms of catching the fish. So local criteria is also applied based on local agreements, more or less like that. The regulation.
Thank you very much for that response. I suppose the next questions that I'll be raising right now may be answered by anyone or everyone, if anyone's interested, or several of you. Like, for instance, the first question that anyone can answer is, how can the maritime industry maintain sustainable livelihood for people? Also, what should people do to contribute in sustaining it? Who's ready to respond to that question?
I can start if I may.
Yes, Dr. Dedi, please.
So, okay, the one initiative that is quite interesting, it's being implemented or at least tried out in Indonesia, is connecting these traditional practices with the what I call it as a green market. So this traditional fishing practices is linked to the demands of global demands, international fish trade, which required better or sustainable fishing practices from the community. So through this marketing change, people are encouraged to do better fishing practices in one hand, but at the same time, they are also given a kind of incentive by giving a premium fish price to this community, to these fishers. That's one example. The other example is the threat for these traditional practices is either free commercializations, as well as the threat from government imposed modern regulations which does not fit with the local regulations. Yeah. So now there are several NGOs working with the communities to kind of formalize these traditional practices in the form of village rules, for example. This kind of codifications and formalizations at the village level gain more power to be then recognized formally by the government at the higher levels, by which then they get a kind of legal protections. That kind of initiative are being also implemented in Indonesia, particularly in eastern part of Indonesia. That's my response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dedi. I suppose we'll have to go a little bit over time for this session because we still have several questions here. They're very interesting. I feel that the audience found your presentations very, very interesting. So we have several questions and they want to hear your answers. So I hope it's okay with everyone. So another question, I suppose William can respond to this and the others as well. How should we prepare our next generation for AI or artificial intelligence? I suppose this is artificial intelligence. AI challenges in the maritime industry.
Yeah, it's a good.
William.
It's a very good question. How do we? What's the challenge? I think to try and maintain traditional cultural practices that have an association with tangible heritage and intangible heritage. And I think the need to revive community spirit and community solidarity is important. I know in Yap, they're wanting to extend the marine protected areas, and they're looking at using traditional knowledge to help in that sustainability. And I think I don't know if you can get that from artificial intelligence. So the sort of continuation of maintaining this connection with traditional cultural practices, using tangible and intangible, and community spirit, community solidarity is a way to help counteract that AI.
Thank you, William. Any other member of the panel would also want to respond to that? Stephen?
Yeah, so I'm on. Last week after the canoe building, I went down to film one of the grandsons who was, his class was actually reenacting rituals of the Samoan people, a welcome ceremony, which is a very interesting ceremony. And I asked the teacher afterwards about this teaching of a cultural practice. And he said that the problem today is that many of the young people are not exposed to the traditions and culture that his generation and the generation before had exposure to because of globalization, because of the fact that a lot of these children now have smartphones, even in rural Samoa. So they're being exposed to a global society which is eroding that intangible cultural heritage that their ancestors had. And I agree wholeheartedly with William that I think that there's definitely a need to relink people, I guess, with their roots. And this is one way of meeting the challenge that could come from an otherwise very robotic pillage of the resources. Because, already we know there's overfishing, and the best way to protect the fish stocks is to make them out of bounds so people cannot fish them. And I think this is something that the traditional societies knew, with the kinds of tapu or taboos associated with these practices. So we need to have the wisdom that the ancestors had to deal with the challenges that we now face. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other point of view you want to raise?
Can I just add to that?
Yes, please.
I think an acknowledgement, I think that traditional cultural practices, indigenous science is as good, or has been in the past, as what we see now as 21st science. You know, we now are using science so much, and we should, but indigenous people used, you know, observation, experimentation for hundreds of years, you know, in developing their practices. So an acknowledgement that this is still very important, as equally important as 21st century science.
Okay, thank you. So I suppose whether AI is a boon or a bane to maritime heritage is another topic for another webinar, considering where our millennials are right now. So the next question, anyone can answer this as well, but probably Aline and Dr. Ms. Yoon Young Jong could also respond to this. We understand the importance of maritime assets and traditions to tourism, and the focus has been on conservation. But how is maritime culture and sustainability practices being propagated, transferred to the next generation? Is it also being done in this time of COVID? So anyone can answer. Yes, Ms. Yoon.
Yeah,
might want to start.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Well, actually, sustainability should be done by cooperation. I think the cooperation is a really important factor. For example, Ministry of Ocean and Fisheries listed the hand net fishery as a tiffs, but since then, a lot of people visited the Somjin area, the largest marsh clam production area. The problem is the marsh clam is really scarce resources. So the local government wants some limitation on the catch. But the local resident does not want, because many people means money for them, for their living can be better. So they discussed about the point they talked about the best way to keep the resources over and over, and they reached the conclusion that there should be a limitation. Of course, the tourism income went down, but the name of the place, the Somjin, means to the Korean people. It means some freshness and cleanness, and every Korean people think Somjin local people already try to keep the nature as it is. It means any product, including fishery, of course, any product from Somjin area gets some premium on their price, because it made in an eco-friendly way. I think it's from the cooperation from the local residents. In that way, I think the Somjin River people can keep their heritage system as it is. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I suppose this next question can be answered by everyone in the cultural context that you just presented. So how can the maritime industry maintain sustainable livelihood for people? I mean, we understand that there are efforts coming from the government, non-government organizations, but from the people themselves, what should they do to continue in sustaining the maritime industry? Maybe we can start with Dr. Delaney. Can we We have Dr. Aguri, we have Steven, and Young Jong, and Bill. Okay.
Thank you. Just to follow up on your question, so what can who do to maintain?
What can people do to maintain the practices from the people's side?
Oh, yeah. Well,
What
coming
efforts
from
should they be?
Japan can be termed a post-industrial society. So I think some of the problems we have in maintaining are a little different than maybe the other cases, but it could be a warning of where things might be going. In Japan, the problem with maintaining is so much of it is this graying older population, and also the issue you have with the fisheries. I mean, traditionally, people have access to resources from living in the coastal community and being a member of the fishing cooperative, right? So as you get a declining, as the numbers of people who are active are declining, it's very difficult for newcomers to come in because they don't, being resident is an issue and being an outsider is an issue because there's this widespread fear and really belief deep down that outsiders won't take care of the resources in the same way as you do because you're doing it because it's been given to you by your ancestors, right? So in terms of what they can do, they need to maybe liberalize a little bit how they educate in schools to get people interested in the sea, and then be a little more open to let newcomers coming in. There's a few initiatives going on now, but it's still very small. So I think that's the biggest challenge they face in Japan in trying to sustain this in the future, is because actually the traditional caretakers are in decline and they're not open to outsiders coming in and taking over the responsibility along with them.
Okay, thank you. I think Ms. Leka from UNESCO would also want to respond to the same question.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that question, because I think it is really an important issue to be raised. From UNESCO's side, as you know, this falls under the implementation of the 2003 convention, which is on the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage. Within the implementation of this convention, what we are trying to support the member states in doing, and the state parties of the convention, is to do inventorying of their ICH, to build capacity in safeguarding intangible cultural heritage, but mainly to really support the community engagement, because as you saw from many of the presentations today, it's really the communities that are the bearers of this traditional knowledge and are the ones that make sure that this is passed on, which leads me to the last one, which is the transmission, especially the intergenerational transmission. This is knowledge that goes back centuries. Many of the panelists made reference to this. It's knowledge that has developed through many years of interaction with nature, being able to cope with the different challenges that nature is presenting them. So it is different indigenous coping mechanisms, but also ways of living with nature, drawing from it in terms of traditional medicine, in terms of ways of constructing houses that are resilient to climate change, in terms of the fishing techniques that you have been presenting. So I think through this convention, and for the Pacific, I can say that almost all countries have ratified this convention and now are in the process of implementing. Many of those countries are now focusing on how to start the inventorying process, which is definitely like the first step in this. So thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you. So going back to the same question, can we have Bill? How can communities, the people themselves, sustain maritime cultural heritage?
Yeah, I go back to this community spirit. I know, just to go back to the fishways, a reason for the decline that was put forward by a major author of a book, 600-page book, was about the decline of fisheries, was that the loss of community spirit. And I think a big part of why the Yappies want to revive them is to revive this community spirit in general, not just for the fishways, but I think, you know, as we've advanced in time, we have machines that take over and do a lot of the things that communities would do together. We need to get back to that community spirit that for in general. I guess that's my short take on how we can try and maintain sustainability.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Anyone else who would like to share insights to answer that question? Well, I suppose everyone is ready for lunch. So we've gone over time. We've had a very interesting session this afternoon. I'm sure there are other questions, but I suppose they can contact each CAP. The audience can contact each CAP for other questions that they have, and you can relay this to the various panelists. So at this point, I'd like to turn over the floor to Ms. Minji Kim.
Thank you, Professor Soledad, Dalisay, and thank you everyone for enthusiastic discussion session that we have. I appreciate everyone for joining this webinar series today and also yesterday to make some comments. For 2 days, we met 10 cases from all over the Asia-Pacific region and heard voices of coastal communities. With facing global urbanization and climate change, the livelihood of coastal communities are threatened along with their intangible cultural heritage. However, at the same time, their wisdom can offer insights for a sustainable future. In this regards, we would like to keep hearing voices from the communities and gathering their traditional knowledge by networking and sharing information. Thanks again for joining us for 2 days. And I should say that the webinar series of ICH will continue. You can find the detailed information on our webpage for the presentation files or even contacts of the presenters. Please join the HK community on Facebook and YouTube, and you may subscribe our e-newsletter and magazine to get the latest news and share ideas. I hope to see you all in the future. Thank you very much for joining us. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minji. Thank you, Sol.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.